I've put a link to the handout page on the Family Search Research Wiki in the chat. There's also a link to DNA Day 2023 at Roots Tech where you can watch the presentations later. They are all being recorded and they will be available for a while and a limited time. I'm not sure how long. Daniel, someone's asking in the chat if there is actually a handout for this particular presentation. Can you clarify?
For this presentation, because it's a case study, we're just going to implement the things that you've learned about in earlier classes today, and I'm going to show you how I did that to solve this problem. So there's no handout. A lot of the, or most of the stuff that we'll talk about actually would have been covered in earlier classes. We're just going to see it in action.
Okay, Daniel, your sound is a little bit garbled. I wonder if it's possible for you to get closer to your microphone or maybe use a headset.
I've got a headset on. Can you hear me better?
A little bit. It's kind of faint though.
Let me try without and see how that goes. All right, can you hear me better?
I think that might be better.
All right, I apologize for that.
It's still a little bit poor. If you can get closer to the mic, that would probably be better.
Is this any better?
I believe it is.
All right.
Let's try that. Let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to DNA Day hosted by the Family Search Library in partnership with Roots Tech. My name is Julia Anderson and I will be moderating today's presentations. For this event, we will be presenting a total of 6 classes, and then at the end of the day, rootstech.org will host 2 additional presentations from industry experts. We are so glad you could join us. Before we get started, we have a couple of housekeeping items. These classes are being live streamed on several platforms, including the Family Search Library's Facebook page, the Family Search Facebook page, YouTube, and rootstech.org. The recordings for these classes will be available on rootstech.org in the next few days. We have created a page on the Family Search Research Wiki for all of today's class content, including the handouts for the individual classes. The link for that wiki page will be shared throughout the day in the chat, and it is posted there, and I will post it again shortly. This particular presentation does not have a separate handout as it is a case study, and we'll just be going through an example of how to use what we've already learned about. Our presenters will be answering questions at the end of each class as time allows. Please post your questions in the chat or comment section of whatever platform you're on, and we will pass them along to the presenter at the end of the presentation. If you do need help with a specific DNA research problem, we encourage you to sign up to meet one-on-one with one of our DNA specialists in a free 40-minute virtual consultation. Just go to the Family Search Library's website at familysearch.org/library and click on Research Help. And we have more appointments there opening up every day, and we book 2 weeks out. So let me introduce the presenter for this class, Daniel Jones. Daniel is an accredited genealogist specializing in Swiss and German research. After graduating magna cum laude from Brigham Young University, Daniel worked professionally for over a dozen years, helping several high-profile clients with research all over Europe. He has experience in numerous archives across more than a dozen countries in Europe, North America, Africa, and Australia. He is currently a research specialist in Germanic and Slavic Europe for the Family Search Library in Salt Lake City, Utah. So we are so excited to hear from Daniel, and we'll get started with double trouble using DNA to solve 2 generations of adoptions. Take it away, Daniel.
Thank you. So let's just delve right in. This is an experience I had helping a close friend of mine with her family tree. All of the names have been changed to protect privacy of living individuals. So don't go looking for these people. You won't find them. But what I hope this will illustrate is that you can use DNA to help you solve your tree problems in the cases of adoption. So we're going to talk first about Julie's parents. Julie was born in 1953, and she was adopted as a child. Now, she had a bit of a leg up in terms of adoptions because she was the oldest of 5 children who were, the younger ones were born between 1956 and 1960. And all 5 of those children were adopted together. And so she has memories of her family prior to the adoption. What she remembers is that her mother was named Ruth, and that she remembers that she had a grandma Lowry. And so this is what we know about Julie. So this right here is her adopted family. The adoptions are going to be indicated in blue. And we know a little bit about her biological family. We know that her mother was Ruth and that her grandmother was a Lowry at some point. Julie went ahead and did a DNA test. And she did the ancestry DNA test. We went through the top matches, and the top match was a grandson, Blake. And so that match right there is not going to help us at all because Blake is going to share all of Julie's DNA, 100% of Julie's DNA. So that's not going to help us figure out who Julie's ancestors are. Okay, we have another match here. And this is an MM, and this is a female, and she's at 1,215 centimorgans. Now, we actually know, or Julie knew, who MM was. She knows that MM is the daughter of Julie's younger brother, Tom. So the first step is to find out how MM and Julie are biologically related. So first we went to the shared centimorgan project at DNA Painter. DNA Painter is found at www.dnapainter.com. The previous class talked about this, and I'm just going to briefly go over why this is such a great tool. It is the shared centimorgan project on that website is a tool to help you calculate the odds of a relationship. And it's based on data from nearly 60,000 known relationships. So they have a lot of scientific data behind the information that they use to calculate the odds of a relationship. It uses that CM total, that centimorgan total. And so we're going to input that total, and it will give us the exact possible biological relationships and the likelihood of those relationships. So we went ahead and put in that number 1215 for Julie's shared centimorgans with MM. And this is what it told us. It told us that there was an 80% likelihood that she was a half aunt or half niece. And there was a 20% chance that she was a full aunt or full niece. So that doesn't tell us exactly what the relationship is. It seems to lean toward a half relationship, but there is a 20% chance that it's a full relationship. So let's keep going down through the matches to see if we can filter out any other known relatives. So now we have a DP, that's an unknown relative, so we'll set that one aside. We have a JJ, who's also unknown, and a BM, who's also unknown. Now, the next match after that was HB. And Julie recognized that this was her sister's daughter. And we've got a centimorgan match of 848. So we're going to go back to that website. HB is the daughter of the sister Susan, and we're going to go ahead and input that. And so the possible relationships with that level of centimorgans in common, we have a half aunt niece relationship. We're hitting at a 97% chance that that's the relationship. And what we found is that there is a 3% likelihood of a more distant relationship, something like a cousin or something like this. So what this actually told us is there was no statistical possibility that HB is the full niece of Julie. What that tells us is that Julie and HB's mother, Susan, were half siblings. Okay, so here's the family tree. There's Ruth. This is the biological tree, and we've got Julie born in 1953, and we've got Susan born in 56 with the daughter that must be the half niece. And then we've got Tom born in 58 with the daughter MM that is either a half niece or a full niece. So what that tells me is that we've got at least a half sibling relationship to Susan and very possibly also to Tom. Now, there's no way to tell whether HB and MM are full cousins or half cousins as well without doing more testing. So we'd want to test Susan and Tom to get that information. But that doesn't really reflect on our research right now with Julie finding more information about Julie's family. So with that information, now we're actually going to delve into some records. Now we know where Julie was born. We know where Susan and Tom were born. And so we're actually going to go into the records around those two families. We know that the mother was Ruth and that Ruth may have been a Lowry or Lowry at some point. And so what we found is in 1940, we found a Ruth Lowry, aged 4, daughter of Leo and Rula Lowry in that census. And then we found a 1952 marriage announcement for a Ruth Lowry, daughter of Leo Lowry, to Marvin Martinez. Then what was really interesting is there was another marriage announcement in the same place where those children were born of a Ruth Lowry Martinez marrying a Will Powell. And so what that actually does is that gives us information about Ruth's family. So here we have Ruth married to Marvin and having child Julie, and then Ruth marrying again to Will and having children Susan, whose daughter HB was a tester, Tom, whose daughter MM was a tester, and then 2 other children. And so the documentary evidence matches the DNA evidence that we see that shows that Julie is a half sibling of her younger siblings, not a full sibling, because we see that she's born of this marriage of Ruth with Marvin and Will and Susan and Tom with Will. So with that in mind, what I did is I helped Julie and we went through and made some DNA clusters. So first we did a list of matches in common, and we did this a few years ago. So some of the cool tools that they have now were not available. So we did some of the old-fashioned way. So first we did a list of matches in common with Julie and her maternal half nieces, MM and HB. What that does is with that match in common, so here's Julie and MM. If I come and click on that shared matches, I get a list of all of my matches. And what's awesome is Ancestry is now starting to help you with that. So in this case, it actually tells us it's on the maternal side. So here's my list, okay? Then what we did is we viewed a list of the total matches and compared the lists to each other. And I actually had to do this on two different windows or open at the same time and just went one by one. And then I started extracting the matches that do not show up on the matches in common. So if I compare this, on the left, we have the in common matches. On the right, we have full list of matches. And so here we just draw lines across, and there is my JJ, but notice that on my total list of matches, JJ shows up a line lower, as well as BM. Now, what that means is here we have DP. DP does not show up on the in common matches, but it does show up on the total matches. So that DP is not related on the mother's side. It's that person is related on the father's side. And so we were able to start putting together a list of matches on the father's side. Again, there are some great tools out there that will help you with this, but the idea and the methodology is the same, to go through and divide up your matches that way. So by default, the new list, the list of people that do not show up on the maternal common matches, is the list of paternal relatives. And again, this is repeatable going back. You just narrow your match list further and further until you can isolate, whatever generation you're going back, isolate the set of matches that are in your cluster. So let's talk about Ruth's biological dad that we have. That's Marvin Martinez. Marvin Martinez was the son of Ray Martinez and Lucy Beach. Now, what was fantastic is because we pulled out all of those paternal DNA matches, we were able to get some key DNA match clusters on the paternal side. So our first match was DB at a 549. And by clustering that group around this DB person, we found that multiple matches are descendants of the Beach family. Notice that Beach is the same last name as Lucy. And so we have a DNA connection to the Lucy Beach family. The SD connection 544, this one was a little bit more difficult because we had more distant matches, but we did see multiple matches descending from the Martinez family. And so we were able to show that the Martinez family was also genetically related to Julie. And that comes through the paternal side through Marvin. And so that was a nice way to show or verify the paper trail showing that Marvin's father was Ray Martinez and his mother was Lucy Beach. Now, something that was really nice is I went back to the ethnic makeup of the person, of Julie, and we're actually able to show that Julie is 6% Indigenous Americans and Mexico, with this focus group here, this community in New Mexico and southern Colorado, and in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. And that's exactly where the Martinez family originally came from, was this group near Taos in New Mexico. And so the DNA ethnic makeup is actually reflecting in the documentary evidence that we were able to find on Marvin Martinez. So it all sort of was a great fit that came together. All right, so now let's go ahead and look at Ruth, Julie's mother, Ruth. The documentary evidence shows that Ruth was the daughter of Leo Lowry and Rula Wilson. So we went back to our clusters to start clustering on the mother's side. However, as we were clustering, the problem we found was that we had absolutely no clusters or matches that had anything in common with the Lowry family. We also had no clusters or anything in common with the Wilson family. We went back to the clusters and sort of started identifying who the ancestors were, and those ancestors those clusters centered on two people. We had the match BM, who had 860 centimorgans, and multiple matches in this cluster descend from the Mrak family, who had immigrated from Slovenia in the early 1900s. We had another more distant match cluster. This is JB, And multiple matches of this cluster descend from a Blake family of Illinois. And so we're not seeing any of the people we expect to see, but we are seeing a bunch of people we don't expect to see. So let's go back to the records and see if the records can tell us some additional information. Well, we found a 1934 marriage record for Leo Lowry and Rula Wilson. And then in the death records, we find this birth and death of a stillborn daughter in 1935. We also find a death record for a stillborn daughter in August of 1936. And then based on some other records, including public records, we find that Ruth was born in October 1936 and that she's 4 years old in the 1940 census, and she's the only child. And so we have evidentiary information that that birth date for Ruth is probably correct. So it raises a couple of questions. How could a couple who have a stillborn child in August 1936 have another child born in October of 1936? And why would that child who was born in October 1936 have no DNA relatives to either of the parents' families? Well, we could in theory think that maybe she was illegitimate, that she was born to a liaison of the mother with someone else. But that 2-year gap, that 2-month gap between births makes that very impossible. And so our theory is we're looking at what's likely an adoption after the death of the couple's second infant. So this nice biological tree we've been building, we actually have to take out and mark that Ruth's parents, that Ruth was also an adopted child of Leo and Rula, and that we actually don't know the biological parents of Ruth at this point. So we go back to our same tools to work on the next generation back. Notice that we didn't really know that Ruth was adopted until we started comparing the DNA and were able to prove that there were no DNA relationships to the people listed in the paper record, but we're getting DNA relationships to people that aren't in the paper record. And that should be a big clue. What's nice about DNA is it will always tell the truth, regardless of what the paper record says. And so, and it's a double-edged sword. Some people don't want to know or don't want those family secrets to come out. Other people want to know, and that can lead to some hard situations. But the DNA will never lie to you in terms of these relationships. So let's go and learn about Ruth's parents. So just kind of a recap, we know that Ruth was the adopted daughter of Leo and Rula, or we're surmising that she was adopted. And we're just going to go back and look at those DNA matches. So our first match is BM with 860 centimorgans. And we have multiple matches descended from this Mrak family who immigrated from Slovenia in the early 1900s. And we have this JB with a lot lower centimorgan total, 351. And he's matching to a lot of Blakes from Illinois. Now, I'm going to tackle the Mrak family first because they are higher up in terms of centimorgan total. And so they're going to be a little easier to sort of ferret out. Okay. Now, what's nice is I went back and looked at that ethnicity estimate, and I noticed that here we have a Slovenia and Croatia group. Within that Eastern Europe and Russia section, we have that nice Slovenia community. And so this actually reflects what we're finding in the DNA connections, is that Julie is going to most likely be descended from this Mrak family who come from Slovenia, and it's reflecting in the DNA totals as well as the ethnicity makeup. So let's delve into some Slovenian ancestors. Well, we have BM. She's at 860 centimorgans, and luckily we had some information about her tree. So research on her tree shows that she was born around 1949. Her father was named Fred Crack, and her mother was named Sophia Mrak. And Sophia was the child of that immigrant couple that a lot of the other DNA matches were tying to, this Joseph and Mary Mrak. And so we know a little bit about BM's connection to the immigrants, the ancestral couple. And we surmise that they're ancestral because all of these other matches are descending from this Joseph and Mary Mrak. So it stands to reason it's genetically pointing to the fact that Julie is also a descendant of this couple. So let's go ahead and look at DNA Painter, that great website. What it does is going to show us the most likely relationships. Now, what we have to do in that list of likely relationships is take out the biologically impossible relationships. So, for example, it may say grandmother, grandchild, but we know that there's only 4 years between the birth of Julie and the birth of BM. So it's impossible for either of those two women to be a grandparent of the other. So we just take out those biologically impossible relationships and focus on the likely ones. So according to DNA Painter, we have a 97% likelihood of a half aunt, half niece, or a first cousin. And we have a 3% likelihood of a half great aunt. Okay, so really we're looking at what's most likely is going to be a half aunt or a first cousin. Now, there are 4 years in between Julie and this match BM. So initially I thought, well, maybe they're first cousins. But as I researched out the family, what we found is that and these are some other relationships. We're not going to worry about those as much because they're so low. What we found is that the trees didn't quite show that a first cousin relationship was really possible. So here we have Julie. Here's her tree, and we have this biological side on Ruth. We don't quite know who her parents are yet. So Ruth is born in 1936. And then notice over here, we have BM's tree on the right. Now, BM is born in 1949, but her mother is born in 1915. And so we have kind of a large age gap between mother and daughter here. And notice that Sophia is married in 1937 and that her parents are born in 1881 and 1892. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go ahead in our next tool. Our next tool is DNA Painter, and this is what are the odds. So this is going to be another tool at dnapainter.com. And I love this tool. I use this tool all the time. So if you've got a potential set of ancestors located, this is going to be the tool for you. What it does, it's called what are the odds, and what it will show is you can put in a bunch of hypothetical relationships, and it's going to show you the odds of those relationships. Now, to be the most effective, you have to have a most recent common ancestor. You have to have a target ancestral couple to show relationship. And what is nice is that you can put in different hypotheses and get a sense of what the odds are for different scenarios of your ancestor fitting into this family cluster. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and put in our first match, which is BM. Now notice here over on the left is our most common ancestor, most recent common ancestor, our Mrak. There he is. He's Joseph Mrak. He's the immigrant. He's the one born in 1881. The family came over in the 1900s. Okay. Up here at the top, that is our match. So we know that BM is here, and notice that we have BM, and we have BM's mother, Sophia, showing up, and her relationship to Joseph Mrak. So that right there is a verified relationship between Joseph and BM. Okay. Now, notice over here, I've got several hypotheses, and it's got 1, 2, 3, and 4. And each of them have a score. So our first hypothesis has a score of 32. Our second has a score of 1, and our fourth has a score of 1 as well. And then we have this last hypothesis, hypothesis 3, has a score of 0. So what this is telling us is that this third hypothesis is genetically impossible. There's not enough DNA or too much DNA. It'll either too much or not enough to say that this is as a possibility. So it's going to help you right off the bat eliminate theorized relationships. Now notice here, I don't put in Julie's name in hypothesis 1, 2, and 4, but I did put in Ruth. And what I do is I also put in the birth dates or the birth years so I can make sure that that those time periods can actually work. So if we look at hypothesis 4, we have hypothesis 4, Julie would be hypothesis 4. Ruth, the mother, is born in 1936. But that is impossible because look when the grandfather, when Joseph died. He died 11 years before Ruth was born. And so that right there would eliminate the option of Ruth being a child of Joseph, because there's no way for a person to have a child back in, at least in this time period, a child 11 years after the death. So by putting these in, you can kind of get a sense of what's going to be possible date-wise. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the scores. So there's always going to be a score 1, and that's going to be the lowest. The lowest odds are going to be 1, 2 something. The higher the number under scores, see the strongest, the higher number that is, the higher the odds. And so right now, what it's telling us, it is 32 times more likely that Ruth is a child of Sophia rather than a first cousin once removed, or a niece, sorry. The Ruth is a child of Sophia rather than a niece of Sophia. So the odds really point to Ruth being a child of Sophia. Now the dotted lines here show us half relationships versus full relationships. So any of the dots that are the same color, that's a full relationship, meaning they share the same parents. So what we're saying here is that BM and Ruth share the same mother, but do not share the same father. And so that's what that dotted line means. Okay. So right now our hypothesis is 32%. Hypothesis 1 is 32% or 32 times more likely than any of the other ones we have. All right, but what we're going to do is we're going to keep going through our matches. So the next match I have is this JA, and I've got some more, and I'm going to put those on the back burner. And as I go, I'm going to add them to the tree. But let's go ahead and go back and add JA. So notice here we have JA, and I've got 450 centimorgans as mentioned. And notice over here, see these red dots? So JA is the nephew of BM. JA's mother is Shelby, who is the younger sister of BM. And they're full siblings. So I've got these purple dotted lines here showing full siblings. And notice what happens to our hypothesis. It used to be 32 times more likely. Now it's showing up as 209 times more likely. That's a 99.5%, or more than 99.5% chance that Ruth fits in the family with Sophia rather than one of Sophia's siblings' children. So with those kind of odds, we have a great hypothesis that Ruth is the daughter of Sophia. Okay. Again, our second hypothesis and our fourth hypothesis show up with a score of 1. We always have a score of 1, but just notice how much that has increased. That score has increased based on adding just one more match. And as we add matches from our cluster to this, what are the odds tree? It's really going to reflect on where your hypotheses show up. Now, again, I will just reiterate, you want to make sure that your birth years are possible. Ruth born to to BM is impossible, right? So that we would never put a hypothesis here. You just always want to make sure that your hypotheses are going to be biologically possible. So let's go back to our trees, and we are going to go ahead and put Sophia in as the mother of Ruth. It fits in with the what are the odds tool. It fits in with all of the DNA matches from the Mrak family cluster. And it fits in timeline wise. Notice here we have Sophia marrying in 1937. So it's entirely possible for her to have a child the year before she marries with someone else. Whether or not she was married to him, we haven't figured that out yet. But timeline wise, it fits in. Okay. Let's go ahead and look at the Blake family. Our key DNA match with the Blake family was JB with 351 centimorgans. And the shared centimorgan project showed a relationship possibility between half first cousin to second cousin. And I did the exact same process with the Blake family as I did with the Mrak family, and put together a tree. Now, I didn't put up that information here, but what I did is I did locate the common matches, and we did find another MRCA, another most recent common ancestral couple of Gregory Blake and Maddie Phillips. And from Illinois originally, they actually died within 250 miles of the Mraz family. So that's a bit of a distance for one of the descendants to travel. And so what we actually need to do is now put together one of the Blake descendants and the Sophia Mraz. We want to get them together. They've got to have met up at some point. Sophia Mraz was from a very small town in the mountain states, and the family were miners and really didn't travel. And so what we've got to do is get one of the Blakes in town where Sophia lived, ideally. So what we're theorizing is the father of Ruth must be a male Blake descendant. Now he's got to be a male, and so we've got to find out, and he doesn't necessarily have to have the last name Blake. It could be a daughter's son, for example. But he's got to be a male, and he's got to be a descendant of this Blake family. So here are the Blakes. We have Gregory, who's born in 1875. And then what I found, and it was a little discouraging, and you may have had this experience, this guy had 5 sons who were biologically able to have children. Now, the youngest, Lewis, is only 15 when Sophia's child, Ruth, was born. And so it's on the young side, but it's not impossible. So I can't discount him at this point. What I had to do is go ahead and track these families, these brothers, through records. So I started with the youngest. We got Lewis. I figured he'd probably be the most easily discounted. And I found him living with his parents in 1935 and 1940. Now, what was amazing, because Ruth was born in 1936, she was conceived in late 1935. And so the 1940 census in the United States tells you where a person was living in 1935. And so that was incredibly useful. So Lewis was living with his parents in 1935 and 1940. We have Albert, who was living with his parents in 1935, but he had moved to California by 1940. We have Harold, who was living with his parents in 1935 and 1940. Now, Ross, he was born in 1910. He's married by 1930. He is living in his parents' town in 1934-5, but he also had moved to California by 1940. And our last guy, Vincent, marries in 1921. He's divorced by 1933. And in 1935, he's living in the same town as Sophia. Now, that was such a revelation. by 1940, he'd moved to California, but it was that 1940 census telling me where he lived in 1935 that really showed that he was in town at the same time Sophia was. Now, we could be tempted to just say, okay, Vincent's got to be the dad because he's in town and nobody else is. However, we do have to keep in mind that Vincent was living in this town in 1935, and he may have had visits from his brothers. So I don't want to totally discount the brothers at this point, but Vincent is by far my most likely candidate. Okay, so he's going to be our guy, and so we're going to put him in. Now, to verify this, we actually did a bit more digging and whatnot. So we found Ruth. Ruth was amenable to doing a DNA test. And so we went ahead and processed her DNA test, and she showed as a half sister to BM. So we knew that Ruth was the child of Sophia. Now, what the miracle was with this family is that Sophia has a younger sister, or at the time had a younger sister, Alice, who was still alive. And Alice was actually about 98 or 99 when we were working through this. And so what happened was BM, and we were talking to BM. We actually contacted her, and we were trying to figure out all this together to figure out the relationship. And BM was kind enough and gracious enough to go talk to Alice. Alice lived in a rest home in a small town in the Mountain West, and told a story that I'm sure she had not told a single soul since 1935. And what happened was Sophia was dating this guy, Vincent. And Vincent was divorced. His wife had moved back to Illinois with the children, and Sophia became pregnant. Sophia was sent to live with relatives. This is a common story. She was sent to live with relatives in the nearby big city where she gave birth to a child. She came back to the small town and then married BM's parent, our father, Fred, and had the family then. Aldine remembered, Alice remembered that Vincent was the father of this child. And what was really interesting is that Ruth sort of completed the story. Ruth told us that her parents had had two children pass away at birth. And when the second child passed away, it was still a birth, the doctor who was delivering that second child told them of a girl who had moved to the city, who was pregnant and was due in a month or two. And she was wanting to give that child up for adoption. And he told them, if you're interested, we can arrange that you can adopt this child that I'm also the child of this woman that I'm also kind of working with through the pregnancy process. And so that's actually how Ruth ended up being adopted, was because the doctor who delivered her adoptive parents' child also delivered her from her biological mother. So it was this really cool combination of DNA, of documents, and of contacting people, and this miracle of this 97-year-old woman with this 70-year-old secret, 80-year-old secret, where we actually were able to figure out Julie's ancestral genetic ancestry. Are there any questions?
Wow, Daniel, that was an amazing case study. We learned so many things from that. We do have a few questions. One is from Lou, and Lou says, my father was adopted, as was his biological mother. All parties are deceased. I'm trying to find any living descendants from his father to DNA test, as well as confirm who his bio mother's mother was. Any suggestions to help? None of these parties has tested, but I have, and so has my father's half sister. They share a mom. Is
Okay.
that too complicated?
No, that makes sense. So what I would suggest is the clustering thing is going to really help you. You may not be able to right off the bat identify um, your biological grandparents, but what clustering will help you do is identify a more distant set of ancestors. So in this case, we didn't necessarily right away identify Ruth's parents, but we were able to identify both sets of Ruth's grandparents, and then work forward with identifying the descendants of both of those couples and identifying candidates who could or could not be an ancestor based on time, location, biology, etc. So what you would do is go ahead and make your clusters from your DNA, get your ancestral couples where all of your clusters are related through this certain common family. Track that family's descendants down through, um, when about I'd say about 12 or 13 years before the parent was born or the key person you're looking for was born, and then identify your candidates. So if your person was born in California, you can eliminate a person who never left South Carolina, for example. But if you've got a branch of that family that also lives in California, that would be one to look at as well. Does that make sense? You're gonna use time and place to really focus on certain segments of the family tree of your clusters.
Fantastic. So we need to use documentary evidence along with DNA evidence to make a conclusion.
Yes, you cannot solve this without both. You must have both.
Wonderful. All right. So our next question is from Lillian. She's wondering how to find all the matches for someone.
I would go through Beth's classes earlier are really going to help a lot. Beth Taylor's classes. So if you missed those classes, go back and rewatch those. They were part 1 and 2. They detail how to go through and find your clusters and mark them, color code them, etc. And then once you found your clusters, then you can focus on that one set of relationships rather than your whole ancestral relationships too much. So you want to identify that one cluster and start working at that cluster level.
That's
And
great.
Beth has those tools, so go watch those classes again.
Yeah, we'll put the link to find those recordings in the chat.
Perfect.
All right. Katie asks if you were able to trace Ruth's family back any farther. She's just curious.
Yes. So what was really interesting on the mother's side, on the Slovenian side, um, Julie was able to meet up with her half aunt BM. They had kind of a nice family reunion, I guess, And based on the paper records for the Slovenian family, we were able to find out the village in Slovenia where they're from and track that family back. For the Blake family from Illinois, we haven't found any people to really talk to that are descendants of Victor. Victor was kind of an interesting guy, or Vincent. But we were able to find some extended relatives that we were able to chat with. But just based on finally figuring out who these people are, we were able to just go back to our normal paper trail research and track those families back.
Thanks, Daniel. So we just have time for one more question. Plaid asks, are there genetic genealogist social workers who help people connecting after the research is done?
That's a good question. I know that there's some groups out there on Facebook that can be really helpful in uniting people. It can be kind of difficult, especially if the family that you are wanting to connect with doesn't, for whatever reason, doesn't want to connect. And there's always sort of ways to go about that. But what I would do is actually look on Facebook. I believe there's a class later about DNA angels that could give you some ideas on how to connect with living people that way, I'd recommend watching that class and getting some ideas there. And that's
Great.
today at 4 or 5, I believe.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. Our time for questions regarding this presentation has expired, but if you need help with a specific DNA research problem, we encourage you to sign up to meet one-on-one with one of our DNA specialists, and those are free 40-minute virtual consultations. Just go to the Family Search Library's website at familysearch.org/library and click on Research Help. Thanks so much for joining us for this webinar. We're going to take a short break and then get started again in just a few minutes with our next presentation, which is Finding an Unknown Father Using DNA, a Case Study, presented by Tanner Tolman, and that will begin at 3:00 p.m. So thanks, everybody.